I'd like to say firstly, on this list it does have a lot of alarming topics that might disturb some viewers. After all, these were real women who committed real crimes, so of course viewer discretion is advised. Hi, my name is Jessa, and please join me as we look together our top 10 most evil women from history you never knew about. Oh, and before we begin, in my last video I was in top 10 unsettling intimacy practices from the Victorian era. I gave you guys a riddle. Did you get it? The riddle was, where is the only place where today comes before yesterday? The answer is, drumroll please, the dictionary. The next riddle will be at the end of this video. Anyways, let's get started. Number 10, Lizzie Borden. It might be too clever to talk about Lizzie Borden as a pun, but I'll ask you guys about that later. Sorry. Anyways, Lizzie Borden was an American woman who was tried and then later acquitted for the axe murderers of her father and stepmother in Massachusetts. Lizzie was very religious and would go to church and do church activities, teaching Sunday school, etc., etc. 3 years later, after her mother passed away, her father remarried to Abby Gray. Lizzie didn't like Abby that much because she suspected Abby's goal was her father's money, and as tensions grew, even more when Andrew would gift real estate to his new family's wife and their stepmother received a house. The night before the murder, their uncle visited their father to discuss property transfer, which placed more tension. After the crime was committed, the police turned their attention to Lizzie as she gave conflicting testimonies within the day. And after many strange occurrences, like her cleaning her dress and burning it up saying it was covered in paint, the town's suspicion of her drugging her father to sleep in order to whack him with an axe, overall the evidence was unclear and caused many controversial issues. However, the trial was later pushed away when another axe murderer similar to her father and her stepmom's case occurred 5 days prior. Still, the reputation of Lizzie and her sister's involvement was tarnished, and the suspecting evidence and accounts of that day remains unsolved. Number 9, Ilse Koch. Ilse Koch was a German war criminal who committed atrocities while her husband, Karl Otto Koch, was commanded at the Buchenwald in World War II. Because of the egregiousness of her alleged allegations, and her actions included that she had selected tattooed prisoners for death in order to fashionably create lampshades and other items from their skin. These are fake, by the way, they're not real. Her 1947 US Military Commission Court trial at Dachau received worldwide media attention, as did the testimony of survivors who ascribed her sadistic and perverse acts of violence to Koch, giving rise to her image as her concentration camp murderesses. However, authoritative testimony from numerous witnesses at her post-war trials firmly established that she had made extensive use of slave labor at the camp, had assaulted inmates on several occasions, and had reported inmates to the camp SS for beatings. Beatings that resulted in death on at least one occasion. While imprisoned, she experienced delusions and had become convinced that the concentration camp survivors would abuse her in the cell. She then ended up taking her own life in jail while serving time. Number 8, Belle Gunness. With an estimated 48 deaths at her hand, Belle Gunness poisoned, bludgeoned, and decapitated her victims, all so that she could collect and line her pockets with savings and insurance policies. This lonely hearts killer was known as Lady Bluebeard, amongst other names, luring her victims with newspaper advertisements. Gunness then began meeting wealthy men through a lovelorn column. Her suitors were her next victims, each of whom brought cash to her farm and then disappeared forever, including John Moo, Henry Galthart, Olaf, Oli B, Andrew, just to name a few. One of the victims' brothers came suspicious, and Gunness's luck seems to be running out. Her farmhouse burnt to the ground, and the smoldering ruins workmen discovered 4 skeletons. 3 were identified as her foster young. However, the 4th, believed to be Gunness, was unexpectedly missing as its skull. After the fire, her victims were unearthed from their shallow graves around the farm. All told, the remains of more than 40 men and minors were exhumed. However, Belle managed to skip out of town before being officially convicted and was never tracked down. Her death has never been confirmed. Number 7, Countess Elizabeth Bathory. I don't know if you've seen the tales of Snow White and how there was this once evil queen who yearned for eternal beauty, but like all fairy tales come from the stem of truth. Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman who was an alleged serial killer from the family Bathory, who owned a land in the Kingdom of Hungary. Bathory and 4 of her servants were accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young and old women between 1590 and 1610. During her arrest, it is commonly believed that Bathory was caught in the act of the torture, but the reality was that she was just having dinner. Most of the witnesses testified that she had heard the accusations from others, but did not actually see it themselves. The servants confessed under torture, which is not credible in contemporary proceedings. The accusations of the murder were based on rumors, and as there is no documents to prove that anyone in the area complained about the Countess, in this time period, if someone was harmed, or let's say someone stole something, a letter would be written out as a complaint. Several authors have argued that Elizabeth Bathory was a victim of conspiracy. Similar during the Salem witch trials, many people insisted that they saw the accused witches flying through the sky. Clearly neither thing happened and are possibly a form of mass delusion or self-interest lies. Historians are therefore extremely careful in how they treat eyewitness accounts of this sort, given the possibility for collective and self-reinforcing delusions. Number 6, Dorothea Helen Puente. Dorothea Helen Puente was an American convicted serial killer, and in the 1980s she ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, and murdered very various elderly and mentally disabled boarders before cashing their social security checks. She paid each of them monthly spendies, but then kept the remaining for what she claimed were expenses for the boarding house. Puente's boarding house was visited by several parole agents as a result of previous orders for her to stay away from the elderly people and not to handle government checks. Despite these frequent visits, she was never charged with anything. Neighbors began to grow suspicious of Puente when she stated that she adopted a homeless man named Chief to serve as a handyman. She had Chief dig the basement and remove soil and garbage from the property, and Chief then put in a newly concrete slab in the basement before he too mysteriously disappeared. In November 1988, another tenant in Puente's house, Alvaro Montoya, disappeared, and after he failed to show up for his meetings, his social worker reported him missing. Police arrived Puente's boarding house and began to search the property. They discovered recently disturbed soil and were able to uncover 7 bodies in the yard. When the investigation began, Puente was not considered a suspect, and as soon as the police let her out of their sight, she basically fled to Los Angeles, where she visited a bar and began to talk to an elderly pensioner. The man recognized her from the news, and then he called the police, and she was charged with 9 counts of murder and was sentenced to 2 years of life. She died at the age of 82 and had always insisted all of her tenants died to natural death. Number 5. Giulia Tofana. Not your typical Chanel number 5, but this too was a femme fatale bottle used by so many women to do one major thing, to get rid of their husbands. By some definitions, Giulia was a girl's girl. After all, it was the 1600s, and women who had malignant husbands who would physically harm and control them was a rather common issue, and the general rule was that unless your spouse passed away, that was the only time a woman could be granted her freedom. In its creation was associated by none other than Giulia Tofana, who apparently was the ringleader of 6 poisoners in Rome. In order to avoid detection from authorities, they actually used the trade name after St. Nicholas and would sell the poison openly as a cosmetic. They even went ahead and used an image of St. Nicholas over the vials, and St. Nicholas and the vial of poison would be sold, affecting over 600 victims, mostly husbands. The active contents inside the vial was unknown, but it was filled with arsenic, lead, and possibly belladonna. It was colorless, tasteless, and therefore very easy to mix with other substances like wine or water. The poisoning would go unnoticed, and its symptoms would mimic other illnesses that was prominent at the time. First dosage would mimic a cold, the third would be digestive issues, and the fourth was death. It was so effective and helpful that when the poison was used to be in its slow active state, it would give the victims time to assume that they were dying and write a will. And if the provider of the poison changed their mind, an antidote was simply lemon juice and vinegar. Fun fact, Mozart at one point was poisoned using aqua tofana, but apparently he himself started this rumor. And if you knew anything about Mozart, he was the Bugs Bunny level type of troll. Number 4. Bonnie Nettles. As cult leaders go, most women of cult leaders were subject to follow their male counterparts. As for Bonnie Nettles, she was the co-founder and co-leader with Marshall Applewhite of the Heaven's Gate New Religious Movement. Although she was registered as a nurse and was married to a businessman named Joseph Nettles, she actually lived a relatively normal life. However, according to the New York Times, she began attempting to contact deceased spirits by conducting regular seances and came to believe that the 19th century monk named Brother Francis frequently spoke with her and gave her instructions. She also visited multiple fortune tellers who told her that she would soon meet a mysterious man who was tall with light hair and fair complexion, descriptions that were very close to Marshall Applewhite's appearance. It was unclear how they met, but after Nettles did an astrological reading for Applewhite, they had an instant spiritual connection. Nettles and Applewhite established Heaven's Gate together as equals, with Nettles running the group and Applewhite speaking for her. Nettles claimed to have communicated with aliens about the next level and told Applewhite to tell their followers. When Nettles died from cancer, the mass followers of Heaven's Gates would then follow through by cultivating to take their own lives in 1997. Number 3. Aileen Wuronos. On a bit recent note, you may or may not have heard in this case in the news, but Aileen Wuronos was a convicted serial killer as she targeted only men as an adult worker. She had up to 7 victims and would target specifically motorists, men who she would meet as a hitchhiker. Her story begins when her mother at the age of 14 married her father at the age of 19. After 2 months of having Aileen, her parents divorced and left her with her alcoholic grandparents who were also malicious in their care. Aileen would then do adult work as a minor once her grandfather kicked her out to live in the woods at the age of 15, and she tried to take her own life multiple times, all failed attempts, and until she met the love of her life, Tyra Moore, in the late 80s is when she would continue a string of crime. While she was incarcerated at the Florida Department of Corrections BCI death row for women, she tried to appeal to the US Supreme Court, which was later denied, and at that point she dismissed her legal counsel and terminated all pending appeals. She would then go off and say, "I killed those men, I robbed them cold as ice, and I'd do it again too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything, because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. I'm so sick of this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again. After extreme mistreatments she suffered while imprisoned and the inhumane management given to her by her officers, in her final interview she turned to the interviewer and said, and also paraphrasing due to censorship, "You sabotaged me, society, and the cops and the system. An attacked woman got executed and was used for books and movies and so on." Her final on-camera words were, "Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass." She was later executed by lethal injection. Number 2, Pearl Fernandez. Again, although this case is one of a very recent event, it still marks as a notable case in the issues that lie in the legal forms, in the protections of minors, and the lack of involvement of CPS. Pearl Fernandez, you may or may not know, was the mother of Gabriel Fernandez, who passed away in Pearl and her boyfriend Usaro's custody. According to The Atlantic, Pearl Fernandez and her boyfriend shot Gabriel with a BB gun, tortured him with pepper spray, beat him with a baseball bat, and forced him to eat cat feces. All injuries pointed to severe psychological and emotional distress endured over a long period of time. It was not one-time event that led to Gabriel's death, it was months of torture. A judge rejected her remorse, stating that Pearl's actions were horrendous and inhumane and nothing short of evil. At her trial, jurors heard how Gabriel was tortured and abused by his mother and her boyfriend after being placed in their care 8 months before his death. Pearl is now serving time at the Central California Women's Facility after being sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Number 1, Jolly Jane. Well, she definitely was jolly when she committed these crimes. Jane Toppin, nicknamed Jolly Jane, was an American serial killer who was known to have committed 12 murders in Massachusetts between 1895 and 1901. How did she commit these? Well, she was a nurse, and her objective was oddly enough to target patients and their family members. Doctors who hired her thought of her as one of their best nurses, but today psychiatrists say that she was one of the most unusual serial killers in history. She was born and raised in the Boston Female Asylum, where unwanted female children were often abandoned. There she was adopted by Ann Toppin, where she was under foster care until she was 18. At this point, she then pursued nursing at Cambridge Hospital in Boston. It was here where she stated her interest in the patients was ought to be taken care of. She grew emotional attachments to them, and if she really liked them, she would fake their medical documents to force them to stay longer at the hospital. She would then also dose her elderly patients with opium to see how they react with the drugs, and then upping the dosage each time. She would also watch them slowly succumb to their death, and she would also mix different types of poisons with her patients and other drugs to stage a sickness and nurse them back to health. Very similar to the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case, where her mother Dee Dee had a mental illness known as Munch-Austin syndrome by proxy. This mental health condition is basically where a caregiver makes up or causes an illness or injury in a person under their care, such as the young or the elderly adult, or a person who has a disability. Because vulnerable people are the victims, MSBP is a form of multiple harm cases. Jolly Jane also had a masochistic side, as she would even get into the bed of her patients who were suffering until they died. She wasn't caught until she used a metallic-based poison on a victim, which finally sparked an investigation. In a court 1902, Topan was found guilty, and then she told her attorney that she actually killed more than 100 people and even got in beds with more of her victims. She was sentenced to stay at an asylum, stayed there until her death. So what was your favorite on your list? Did you learn anything interesting today? Let me know. Oh, right, your next riddle. Are you ready? What can go through glass without breaking it? Be sure to put your answer in the comment below, and I'll reveal the next answer in the next video. Top 10 unusual ancient tomb discoveries you've never seen before. That's all for today. Thank you for joining me. My name is Jessa. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see your beautiful faces in the next one. Bye bye!